At the dawn of the 20th century, Belgium was the fourth industrial and commercial power in the world. Its mines, its metal and glass industries, and textile mills were the backbone. In 1900 began When Hergé was born in 1907, the reign of King Leopold II drew to an end. And gave Belgium a valuable colony full of riches, the Congo. The well-off enjoyed the buzz of La Belle Époque. Georges Rémy, the future Hergé, was the oldest son of a modest family. His father worked in a ready-to-wear clothing shop. The grandmother was a true Bruxelloise. She spoke Marolien, a dialect consisting of a mixture of Flemish and French, and which was made famous at the beginning of the century by the play Miss Beulemans' Wedding. It's annoying, isn't it? There are complaints every day. Every day you make some blunder or other. I'm sorry, Monsieur Bellemans. Bellemans. My name is Beulemans. Stop showing off your French and putting on those Parisian airs and graces. And meanwhile, you neglect your job. Oh, I don't like this boy. They say that you're a troublemaker and people avoid you. I haven't noticed this kind of ostracism. Ostracism? Ostracism? You see, huh? Oh, I really don't like this boy. You see? You see what? You say ostracism to Dad. He doesn't know what that means, and so what? So he thinks it's you who are an imbecile. When war breaks out and the neutrality of Belgium is betrayed, Georges Rémy is 7 years old. Hundreds of people lose their homes. A small part of the army, led by King Albert, is able to resist and fiercely defends the independence of a portion of the territory along the North Sea. It is here that the legend of the Night King was born. It is in a Brussels occupied by German soldiers that Georges Rémy grows up. Food restrictions don't stop him from playing in the street like all the children of his age. He will remember his childhood exploits in the series Quick and Flopke, the adventures of two Brussels kids who play 1,000 tricks on the neighborhood policeman. While children put an arsenal of wood and cardboard together, technological progress decided the issue of the First World War. Little Georges tells himself stories, which he also draws in his notebooks. The first one is a somber affair of German spies. When the war finally comes to an end, it is joy and triumph for the victors. The prestige of King Albert strengthens the Belgian monarchy for many years. The sovereign takes important political measures and gives all male citizens the right to vote. But Belgium, like the rest of Europe, is bankrupt. The country nevertheless revives more rapidly than its neighbors, thanks to the resources of the Congo. And soon life returns, and in the background, the sounds of jazz and of the Charleston, the music of the victorious. At the end of the war, Georges Remy is 11 years old. Under pressure from his father's well-intentioned boss, the child leaves a secular, non-confessional school for a Catholic private school. Though difficult for him to endure at first, the imposed change will for many years put Hergé firmly in the camp of the traditionalist and Catholic right. Without trying to be determinist, I think that the formula that best summarizes Hergé's environment, which is at once familial, political, economic and local, indeed it's also Belgian, which counts, is social Catholicism. But people misunderstand that word. During the 19th century and still in the 20th century, social Catholicism is quite conservative. It's not at all a left-wing Catholicism. It's a kind of moral judgment on contemporary society. Let's say capitalist, to keep it simple. It's a society dominated by money, by materialism, which has lost its soul. One must give that soul back to society. But we pull up our sleeves and get on with it. It can lead, among other things, to Catholic action or even to more corporatist views. We're interested in the fate of the working classes, and in a certain way, we're wary of politics. Politics is, after all, somehow dirty. Yet, the social and political situation of Belgium is far from being monolithic. To the linguistic division between the French speakers and the Flemish can be added the gap that separates socialists from Catholics. The two sides share a loyal clientele, though neither has enough power to win against the other. At the same time, Georges was forced to leave both the school with no God and the Belgian Boy Scouts to join the Catholic Scouts. Scouting becomes the great passion of his youth. It's the Scouts who give him the opportunity to publish his first drawings. In February 1922, he's 14 years old, the signature of Georges Remy appears in the journal The Belgian Boy Scout. And 2 years later, we discover the familiar signature of Hergé. And soon the young man publishes his first story in images, The Adventures of Totor. But he doesn't yet reach the movement of a true comic strip. Rather, it is that of a simple illustrated narrative. At the end of his secondary school, Hergé must find a job. With the recommendation of a head scout, he's hired by a Catholic and conservative newspaper, Le 20e siècle, the 20th century. At first, the young man is a mere clerk in the subscription department. When Hergé returns from his military service, the director of the newspaper, a priest by the name of Wallet, tries to turn him into a reporter photographer. It's a total failure. Fortunately, the priest noticed the drawings that Hergé published in the Belgian Boy Scout. Hergé is only 20, and Father Wallet is the one who gives him his first real chance. It is that which explains the ideological influence that the priest will keep for a long time over the young cartoonist.
L'abbé Wallet est une très forte personnalité.
Father Wallet is a very strong personality. Personally, he makes me think of a robber monk from the Middle Ages. That is to say, first physically, he's very tall, very hefty, very loud, a real polemicist. He was somehow very committed, independent of his gift of the gab and his more florid side. Finally, his very likable side. Politically, he was very committed and ultra-conservative, and as such quickly moved to enthusiasm for Mussolini and for Mussolini's brand of fascism. Wallet makes Hergé into a sort of multifunctional illustrator. He entrusts him with numerous illustration works and soon the responsibility of a youth supplement entitled Le Petit Vingtième, the Little 20th. When he creates the character of Tintin, the 10th of January 1929, Hergé naturally makes him a reporter, the equivalent of the great reporters that he dreamed of being, the Albert Londres or the Joseph Kessels. Father Wallet was a visceral anti-communist. A commissioned assignment, Tintin's first adventure, was a virulent charge against Bolshevism. The USSR is particularly despised because it attacks religion. But more than a political story, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets is a naive and often awkward history. Hergé linked gag after gag and disaster after disaster without quite knowing where the story would take him. Sometimes the drawings bear witness to a rare virtuosity, especially when Hergé illustrates the speed of cars, of planes and of trains. The young Hergé had neither the time nor the means to go to Russia, nor to analyze an abundance of documentation. All the elements of local color were taken from the book Moscou sans viol, Moscow Unveiled, a violent pamphlet published by a former Belgian consul. Hergé literally scripted certain pages, for example, the famous scene of the rigged elections. In another sequence, Hergé denounces the foreign travelers, duped by Soviet propaganda. It's a way of discrediting the supporters that the USSR found in Belgium, in the red villages of Wallonia. To be sure, the misery in Russia was real, and the situation of many of its children was tragic after the Civil War. But misery was prevalent also in Belgium, notably in the Borinage, the coal mines around the city of Charleroi, that several well-known European personalities like André Gide and Joris Ivens came to film. These problems interested neither the young Hergé nor the director of the 20e siècle. For many years unobtainable, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets was one of the principal arguments used by Hergé's enemies. But his first adventure is above all the work of an impressionable young man. If Father Wallet had narrow views, he also had a sharp sense for publicity. Mobilizing the Catholic Scouts, he organized a false return of Tintin. This coincided with the end of the publication in Le Petit Vingtième. The crowd of young people that gathered in front of the North Station convinced Hergé to prolong Tintin's career. It is in America that Hergé had wanted to send Tintin after his return from the land of the Soviets. But Father Wallet disagreed with this idea. He wanted to send Tintin to the Congo. The great attack on Bolshevist Russia was to be followed by a tribute to the immense Belgian colony. The Congo, a veritable El Dorado thanks to the riches of its mines, was also a missionary land. In 1885, when this gigantic territory was bestowed upon Leopold II, he agreed that all the missions could prosper there. The competition between the enemies of old, the Protestant and Catholic churches, was dreadful. Tintin in the Congo is the only book by Hergé where the Catholic religion is explicitly put into focus. Tintin also fights against tribalism and the secret societies who object to the actions of the white man. But the political and religious aspects don't hog the scene. Tintin's Congo is above all a land of adventures, an inexhaustible hunting ground. With all his might, Tintin massacres wild animals at a time when ecological issues were not in focus. Obviously, one of the goals of the book is to revive colonial vocations because the territory lacks a labor force. In Tintin in the Congo, the white man is king and paternalism triumphs. There are few anti-colonialists in any country. The 1931 colonial exhibition in Paris, for example, attracts 30 to 40 million visitors, while a small anti-colonial exhibition organized by the Communist Party and the Surrealists brought in, I believe, less than 5,000 people. Yet 30 years later, there are no more colonial empires. In 1931, there are but a few anti-colonialists. It is obvious that Hergé and Tintin are surrounded by a paternalist atmosphere, particularly in the first version, with an explicit allusion, we know, to Belgium. And it is significant that today's version has replaced Belgium by a mathematical equation. This tells you everything about the 20th century. In the last images of Tintin in the Congo, Hergé accelerates the rhythm as he's pressed to finish with the lines and send his hero off to America. Hergé, whose childhood was fed by burlesque cinema and the first westerns, had a fascination for many aspects of North American culture. The skyscrapers, the Indians, speed, mechanization, and jazz. Like a large part of the European right wing at the time, Father Wallet was, on the other hand, much more reticent. Because it's the country where mammon rules. Because it's also the country of secondary Protestantism and even of Freemasonry. But above all, it is a country where the triumph of money and the attendant vulgarity leave a bitter taste in the mouths of the conservative Catholic until it wears off, which never takes long. The book is characteristic of this ambivalence. Hergé essentially relied on two sources: the Scène de la Vie Future by Georges Duhamel and the magazine Le Crapouillot, of which he became an assiduous reader. The adventure begins in Chicago with an encounter with Al Capone, whose henchman Tintin pursues throughout the book. Prohibition and the War of the Clans were popularized by the first mystery thrillers. Tintin in America is the first book where Hergé can give free rein to his attraction to speed and modernity. Tintin doesn't walk, he runs. He doesn't visit, he rushes from one place to another. But this third adventure of Tintin's also marks, on the part of Hergé, a beginning of ideological freedom. It is in Tintin in America that we find the first example of his caring nature, his sympathizing with others, still like a Boy Scout in his expression. Tintin here rallies to the defense of the Indians against the American soldiers who chased them away, bayonet in hand, after discovering oil reserves. This question of the Indians continued to preoccupy Hergé all of his life, and the illustrator would still contemplate, many years later, devoting an entire book to the subject. Tintin continues his exploration of the planet, and this time goes towards the Orient. He embarks on a long cruise, discovering first Egypt and India, always in a somewhat mythological way, before continuing on towards China. When Le Petit Vingtième announced that the reporter would pursue his adventures as far as Shanghai, Hergé is put into contact with a Chinese student named Chang Chongzhen. This meeting will dramatically change Hergé's life and the adventures of Tintin. He was really a friend, not only a friend, but at the same time, I'd say, a master of thought, if you will, because he made me understand that Western civilization was not the only one. In fact, there were others. When Hergé began to draw the Blue Lotus, China was experiencing particularly troubling times. China was ravaged by catastrophic floods. This new catastrophe was added to the armed confrontations between various factions of warlords. In 1931, Japan used a railroad sabotage, misleadingly attributed to Chinese bandits, as a pretext to invade Manchuria. The government of Nanking was incapable of putting up any real resistance to the aggressors. It was the beginning of a long occupation. Around 1933, the Japanese expanded into northern China, benefiting from the divisions between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao. The Japanese militarists little by little tightened their noose. Shanghai was bombarded, and the League of Nations, apart from creating an investigative commission, remained powerless. With the meeting of Chiang began the documentation concerns. It is now impossible for Hergé to be content with the stereotypical imagery of popular novels. Hergé parts from Father Wallet and distances himself from the ideology that surrounds him. He supports the Chinese point of view against Japan and criticizes the role of the West in the international concession of Shanghai.
C'est aussi, pour la première fois, un discours...
Here we also find for the first time a speech that we can qualify as being anti-racist, in any case far removed from xenophobia. And to all those, sometimes myself included, who would underline that Hergé had xenophobic or anti-Semitic slip-ups, I would remind them, as a personal observation, that my most anti-racist memory remains that famous page when Tintin meets Chiang, where Tintin explains to Chiang how the Chinese are caricaturized by Westerners. This really made Chiang laugh. Hergé's views, as expressed in the Blue Lotus, elicit strong protests from the Japanese embassy. When Tintin leaves his Chinese friends, he can't imagine that he will again see Chang 25 years later. But he already knows that the problems of China are far from being resolved. It is on the other side of the planet that his new adventures will take place, on the boundary of two South American states that are in a dispute over an oil deposit. Hergé is directly inspired by the War of Gran Chaco that rages in Latin America between Bolivia and Paraguay. Again, it's the magazine Le Crapouillot which alerted Hergé to this bloody conflict, which received little attention in Europe. But the War of Gran Chaco is only a secondary element in the book The Broken Heir. For the first time, the script has a soundly built storyline. From beginning to end, Tintin is in pursuit to retrieve a stolen fetish. The cartoonist even uses the story to denounce the most notorious arms dealer of the time, Basil Zaharoff, whose name is barely disguised. This Greek, who was ennobled by the British monarch, made his fortune during the Great War by selling arms to all warring sides. Gun Dealer in The Broken Heir is but one example, among others, of the theme of trafficking that Hergé was obsessed with in the 30s. The trafficking of guns and drugs, counterfeit money, the power of secret societies were regularly denounced by magazines like Le Crapouillot that told of innumerable scandals, the most famous being the Stavisky affair. Hergé took the premise of this affair for one of the many adventures of Quick and Flipke. In the middle of the 30s, most European countries saw the growing influence of the extreme right wing. The economic crisis had pushed parts of a disorientated population into the arms of dictators who could sometimes appear likable. In Belgium, the Flemish extreme right was unquestionably nationalist and favoured the breakup of the country. On the French-speaking side, it was a dynamic young man whose rhetoric carried away enthusiastic crowds. What do you expect? We're the youth, we're the force, we're the life. Before these corrupted parties in a regime of agony, we must overcome. Rex is supported by the entire country. It is for this reason that Rex will triumph. Léon de Grelle, sometime journalist of Le XXe siècle, was a true contemporary of Hergé's and came from an identical environment. In 1932, before the foundation of the Rexist party, Hergé had illustrated the book Histoire de la guerre scolaire.
Pour moi, je veux même pas essayer de savoir si...
For me, I don't care to know if Georges Rémy had a Rexist card or not in the 30s. For me, he was sympathetic to the Rexist movement, of that there is no doubt. After that, he probably evolved, but in the 30s he was in the Rexist movement. He was absolutely not a militant, and it's obvious that he didn't have a head for politics. But the fact remains that, like many young Belgians, he was a part of that movement. De Grelle formed an alliance with the Flemish nationalists and triumphed in the elections of 1936. But the church condemned de Grelle, and the movement lost a part of its following. In 1937, a union of the traditional parties succeeded in blocking his path to power. Hergé, for his part, distanced himself from de Grelle, who was becoming more and more radical. With King Ottokar's sceptre, drawn on the eve of the Second World War, Hergé transposed numerous elements of current events within the framework of two imaginary countries, Moldavia and Borduria. This provided him with the means to stylize events and evoke current events as if he were already distant from them. The plot involves the king of a small country being threatened by a foreign invader. Moldavia is a summary of several countries of Central Europe. But it is above all a metaphor for Belgium, threatened by its own neutrality. The king Muscat XII, whose throne Tintin saves, is not without resemblance to Leopold III, to whom Hergé felt particularly attached. Another implied reference was the Moldavian language, which was directly inspired by Marolien, the Brussels dialect spoken by Hergé's grandmother. The story itself is a clear denunciation of the Nazi Anschluss which absorbed Austria in March of 1938. In the book, Borduria, the equivalent of Germany, attempts to annex Moldavia with the aid of a certain Mustler, whose name is an obvious synthesis of Mussolini and Hitler. Numerous references permit the identification of the Bordurians with the Nazis, the patronyms, the uniforms, the Heinkel planes, and also the technique of the takeover, which is made up of a fifth column, infiltrating Moldavia under the name of the Party of the Steel Guard. The sound of marching boots approaches. While France and England declare war on Germany, Belgium retreats further into its neutrality. A third of the Belgian troops is placed along the German border, whereas the remaining two-thirds keep watch over the French border. This pacifist position was, for a long time, that of Hergé. For many years, in the gags of Quick and Flipke, the cartoonist put the Italians, Germans, English and French back to back. Leopold III opted for an increasingly cautious political approach of Hitler's imperialism. He believed Belgium could save itself by regaining a neutrality that was once theirs, but that was lost after the trauma of World War I. And he made the choice with others to go back to neutrality. He was supported by the masses of the Belgian monarchists, including a certain Georges Rémy. In 1939, when war erupted between France and Germany, Belgium, of course, remained neutral. During many weeks, Hergé drew the adventures of a certain Mr. Bellum, which in Latin means war. He's a warmongering type character whom Hergé ridiculed. Through this little-known adventure that was published in a neutralist newspaper, and by his ridiculed character, Hergé clearly put himself on the side of those who supported the king and his policy of neutrality. Let us not engage ourselves not only in controversy, but now in the war between France and Germany. Let us not choose sides. It is maybe history, if we may say so, that forced Belgium to take sides. The 10th of May 1940, German troops enter Belgium. This also marked the end of the newspaper Le 20e siècle, interrupting Tintin in a land of black gold, which accurately and ominously deals with the imminence of the conflict. Reality overtook Hergé. The first period of the adventures of Tintin reached an end. After a brief period of exile in France, Hergé returns to Belgium, when King Leopold III summoned him to go back to work. But what work, now that Le 20e siècle has gone? Hergé refuses the offers by Léon de Grelle and finally finds refuge at the newspaper Le Soir, which appears to be under the control of the occupying forces.
Le Soir
of Raymond de Becker was not a newspaper like the others. It wasn't Le Nouveau Journal of Paul Collins and Robert Poulet. It wasn't Le Pays Réel of Rex. It wasn't a militant newspaper. It wasn't a newspaper calling for murders. Let's say that it was collaboration with a human face, moderate, which means a more distinguished collaboration than the one practiced by those militant newspapers that didn't hesitate to pull up their sleeves and go into action. It's obvious that Raymond de Becker believed that the choice for a German Europe was the best choice to save Belgium. It is indeed what he said during his trial at the end of the war. It's clear that the newspaper presented press releases from the Propaganda Abteilung, that the newspaper was also financed by them, and that it served German interests. No one was going to ask if it served them objectively or not. It was a newspaper at the service of the occupier. That is crystal clear. The books drawn at this time are quite intentionally removed from reality. Hergé focuses on his own universe, which he begins to improve with more detail. Captain Haddock steps in for the first time in The Crab with the Golden Claws, the first adventure made for Le Soir. In The Secret of Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure, the prototype of an escapist story, two other fundamental elements are put into place: the Chateau of Moulinsart and Professor Calculus. Only one of the books drawn during the occupation has any real traces of reality: The Shooting Star. The first pages unwind into an atmosphere of the end of the world and a perfect metaphor of the debacle. The prophet Philippulus surveys the devastated streets, preaching penitence with propagandistic undertones. The succession of events in the story opens itself up to criticism. In The Shooting Star, the good guys, who are the scholars, all belong to countries which, at the time of the writing and afterwards, are either countries from the good side of the New Europe, but obviously England, for example, is not mentioned. Neither is the United States, because the bad guys are all Americans or work for the United States. We can see an old version of the American flag. The flag disappeared. It's like a confession, this disappearance of the flag. If it wasn't compromising, why should it have been kept? Even the evil mastermind changes his name from Blumenstein to Bollwinkel, but he still retained his Semitic appearance. In a way, the picture remains a confession. This doesn't mean that in 1940 to 1942, Hergé was particularly anti-Semitic. He still was what he had been before. It means more or less something like that, and he probably perceived this contradiction progressively. At the same time, one may wonder whether he ever completely perceived it. During this time, the war, which seemed to be won by Nazi Germany, takes a turn. Positions become more radical. De Grelle entered into active collaboration, donning the Waffen-SS uniform. The attitude of King Leopold III, first supported by a majority of the population, became increasingly criticized. When Belgium is liberated, the king is absent, held prisoner in Germany. A gulf separates those who resisted and those who accommodated the occupying Nazis. Hergé was banned from publication and treated as a collaborator.
Pour moi, l'autre rupture, après la rencontre avec l'abbé Wallet et le Lotus
For me, the other rupture, after the meeting with Father Wallet in the Blue Lotus, is not the occupation, as most people think, or even June 1940, which was a breakdown for many who believed in Belgium, in France, and their armies. But it was the liberation. For Hergé, the shock occurred here. In fact, for him, it wasn't the liberation, it was the purges that followed. However, he wasn't tried because some individuals did everything to have the prosecutor, i.e. the military auditor, forget about the file. There was never a trial. He spent one night in prison. Many involved in resistance and many collaborators spent months and months, if not years, in prison. One can say it marked them. But it's not one night that was going to... Nevertheless, it shook Hergé. Why? First, because he was somewhat afraid and because he was disgusted by Belgium, disgusted by the purges, disgusted by what he considered to be an injustice, not only regarding himself, because he was blacklisted, boycotted, and could not publish the way he wanted. He was considered uncivic, if not in the eyes of the law. And after that, after the war, he never regretted anything of what he did. I'm talking about personal regrets in his private correspondence and discussions with friends. I'm not talking about what he said in official interviews. I'm talking about the real Hergé, the private Hergé. He never had any regrets. Although the shock was profound, Hergé's quarantine wouldn't last for very long. The books continued to be published by Castermans, and because of the introduction of colour, their success began to go beyond Belgium. In 1946, a former résistant, Raymond Leblanc, created a weekly for children entitled Tintin. Here, Hergé published The Temple of the Sun, finishing the story that was interrupted 2 years earlier in Le Soir. Then he resumed Tintin in the Land of Black Gold, which he had started just before the war. The story takes place mostly in Palestine before the birth of the State of Israel, and puts onto the scene the conflict of the Zionists against the British occupier. Tintin is confused with a Jewish terrorist named Goldstein, who looks like his twin. Nothing in this adventure allows Hergé to be accused of anti-Semitism. The most remarkable thing in this book is the metamorphosis that it underwent. Initially published in 1949, Tintin in the Land of Black Gold was reviewed and corrected 20 years later at the time of its publication in England, and many historical elements were eliminated to give the story a more timeless appearance. In the same spirit, all the books written before the war were profoundly changed at the moment they were made in colour. Hergé corrected the clumsiness, eliminated the references to Belgium, eliminated things which could be interpreted as offensive. But these changes could not occur without some increased blandness or distortions. For Belgium, as for Hergé, the end of the war didn't really begin before 1950. The abdication of Leopold III in favour of his son Baudouin put an end to the royal question that had divided the country since the liberation. As for Hergé, he began the grand adventure that would hold his readers spellbound for nearly 4 years, Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon. It wasn't the first time that the subject was used in a story. Jules Verne, Méliès, Fritz Lang and many others had already spoken of voyages to the moon. But the two books by Hergé distinguished themselves from those by the author's preoccupation with authenticity. Never had research been pushed so far. Hergé consulted the top specialists of the time and had a detailed model of the rocket constructed. I had a model constructed, as you can see here, that I indeed submitted, and so everything was plausible. Plausible on condition that my friend Calculus had found an engine running on nuclear energy. In theory, at least. Visually, the two books are remarkable in their plausibility, even if the solutions used later in the conquest of space would prove to be rather different from those imagined by Hergé. Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon are witnesses to a euphoric vision of science that materialized at the World's Fair in Brussels in 1958. Nuclear energy was king in Calculus's rocket as it was in the atomium. Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon are two books that mark a sort of triumph of the cult of science, even though it's an adventure with spirit, using the resources of the adventure novel, often more traditional, almost melodramatic, with betrayal, etc. Nevertheless, we can interpret this as a very good example of the scientist's utopia of a Europe that rebuilds itself, a Europe that begins anew. It's the Europe of development. It's the Europe of the spread of the automobile and airplanes, which are no longer rare and will soon conquer space. There, once again, Hergé was ahead of his time. And I'm less impressed by the fact that technically he drew these instruments quite well. Basically, I don't believe it's fundamental. Conversely, he was mentally ahead of his time. While it's a book from the 50s, he already addressed the problems of the 60s, which is the fact that we go from the Cold War to the competition between two worlds that ruled the spirit of the time on a technological level. And that was much less obvious in the 50s than it would be in 1960. And once more, Hergé was ahead of his time. The heroes of the 50s are no longer explorers or reporters. They're scientists, those who master the natural forces. From here on in, Professor Calculus occupied a central place in the adventures of Tintin. When Calculus makes his first appearance in Red Rackham's Treasure, he's a likable amateur scientist. His inventions are neither very serious nor very reliable, and his deafness makes him a stranger to the problems of the world. On top of it all, he believes in divination. But Calculus progresses quickly. At the time of the lunar adventure, he's become a nuclear physicist, a physicist who proclaims that his research has an exclusively humanistic and pacifist vision. In the Calculus Affair, the book that follows Explorers on the Moon, Hergé proposes a more pessimistic vision of science based on the Cold War and the arms race. In a Stalinist state, the military sees a professor's invention, an ultrasonic machine intending to transform it into an engine of death with terrifying powers. Calculus prefers to destroy his blueprints. His attitude, then, evokes that of the scientists such as Einstein and Oppenheimer, who become unflinching adversaries of the atomic bomb after having promoted its making and perfection. From then on, Calculus renounces hard science. He makes roller skates with motorized wheels in coax and stock, and in the Castafiore emerald, he cultivates his garden and creates a new variety of rose, white of course, which he dedicates to the opera singer. Hergé himself also evolved a great deal, moving more and more away from the arrogant Catholicism of his youth.
On peut dire que peu à peu la morale
One could say that the
reste,
morality stays,
alors que la
but bit by
religion
bit
et la
religion and
politique,
militant politics,
militantes
which supposedly
politiques
Hergé never had,
aujourd'hui,
disappear. And that moral could be qualified as humanist, or even humanitarian. Coke and Stock denounces the slave trade during the 20th century. The Castafiore emerald takes a side of the Tzigan gypsies. The Temple of the Sun takes a side of the South American Indians. Hergé is equally sensitive to the growing power of the media. Having made Tintin a reporter, even though he would rather live his adventures than write about them, Hergé always held the communication media in high esteem. A television set appears in the original version of the Black Island in 1937, while the first experiments with television had been conducted the preceding year in England. And Belgium would have to wait another 20 years for its first broadcasts. Tintin, who was a reporter in his first adventures, becomes an object of curiosity for journalists at the end of his career. The press turns to sensationalism and spreads absurd rumors. Little by little, television begins to dominate the other medias and scrambles information with noise, stupidity, and commercials. One character symbolizes to perfection this last period of work, Séraphin Lampion, symbol of the gregariousness and triteness, the perfect target for all television commercials. At the beginning of the work, the Thompson twins had one foot in the 19th century. Lampion personifies a completely different form of self-gratifying nonsense. We're obliged to have the biggest stars, the biggest shows, to have the artists with the most talent to gnaw away at the other channels' ratings. In Tintin and the Picaros, his last finished book, Hergé returned to a political theme after distancing himself from it for almost 20 years. But the political contents of this book are less interesting than the expression aimed at the mass media. From the beginning to the end of the story, one is in the world of entertainment. Everything begins with the opposition of two television channels, a purely fictional plot. And it will be thanks to a carnival that a coup d'etat will occur. No wonder, then, that Hergé puts the two regimes back to back. The Picaros are far removed from the caricatural denouncement of communist Russia, but very far also from Hergé's almost militant position in the Blue Lotus. Here, Hergé proposes a disillusioned statement as witness to the end of these ideologies.
Mais au fur et à mesure qu'on cesse de tenir
The
à ces
more we
opinions,
stop to hold to our opinions,
La vie
the
devient plus
easier
facile.
life becomes.
la vie devient
Life
beaucoup plus
becomes
facile.
much
C'est
easier.
Nietzsche qui disait
It is
aussi
Nietzsche who
que
said that
toute
every
conviction
conviction
est
is a
une
prison.
Et c'est terriblement
And it's
vrai.
absolutely true. The adventures of Tintin were nourished by the main events of the century, justifying, little by little, the title of the magazine that gave them life, Le Petit Vingtième, the Little 20th. But the real secret of Hergé is maybe that clear line that permitted him to purify reality, retaining only the substance. A child of today can still enjoy the Blue Lotus without knowing anything about the war between China and Japan. Just as Tintin never ages, the books of Hergé have withstood the century without a wrinkle.